Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar for the year. We're doing it in collaboration with the HR and IR Consultancy. My name is Neil Kutzer. I'm the Head of Employment at CHM. With me this morning is Gail Barrable. She's a partner in our employment practice, and Craig Lawrence, who's a senior consultant in the HR and IR Consultancy. Our webinar today is about a very controversial topic, as it always is. And this is something that rightly or wrongly provokes a lot of emotion in people, and it's something that we just have to deal with in the workplace. And there are some important changes that have been brought through. We thought that we would share some of our insights with you in the webinar this morning. So I think if we move on to the first slide, just by way of a general introduction, the first set of the draft regulations were published on the 12th of May, 2023. Now, the Department of Employment and Labour conducted various roadshows and public consultations over several months on these issues. Many of us went to those. They were very well attended in general. And of course, there was lots of criticism that was bandied about at those roadshows. And of course, this was to be expected. There was lots of criticism that this was going to be impractical and it was going to create havoc for businesses. And of course, you've probably read lots in the media about all of this as well. Probably the most prominent criticism came from Solidarity, and they went so far as to file an application challenging the constitutionality of several of the provisions of the Employment Equity Act, Amendment Act, and particularly the whole idea of sectoral targets being set by the Minister of Labour. Now, even before they did this, they had lodged a complaint, I think in about 2021, against the government's proposed interventions with the International Labour Organization. Now, that dispute was mediated over a period of 9 months, and the CCMA was involved. And ultimately, a settlement agreement was reached on the 28th of June, 2023. And this also made the news at the time, and Solidarity had trumpeted it as a big victory for the union. Now, what's interesting about that settlement agreement, and Gail will speak to it and the implications of it as part of her talk, but the settlement agreement is important because it seems to inform much of what is set out in the new draft regulations, particularly in relation to the text, not so much the actual sectoral targets. Now, the terms of that settlement appear almost verbatim in the new regulations, which are published on the 1st of February. And Gail will talk about this, but there's an allusion in there to the temporary nature of employment equity, which is, I think, the first time that this has appeared in legislation. Now, what temporary means is probably something up for debate, but the long and the short of it is that this settlement agreement was instrumental in relation to the publication of these new revised regulations. Now, the new regulations are somewhat curious. They set out regulations in the traditional sense, but then because of this additional text from the settlement agreement, it's almost a hybrid. It's almost as though the explanatory memorandum that's supposed to go with the regulations has been incorporated into the regulation. So it's almost a code of good practice in a very strange way. So it's a bit of a curious document. So at a high level, what has changed, and will there be more changes? Now, the changes, I think, are rather subtle in some senses, and in other senses, some people may say that, Gail and I actually had a bit of a discussion about this morning, that some of the changes are probably a bit more far-reaching. It depends on your interpretation of certain words in the regulations. But the settlement agreement that's been incorporated into these regulations, in our view, doesn't change much. We think that it merely reinforces what we already know to be true. The fact that you are not able to dismiss somebody to achieve employment equity, that you should have justifiable reasons for not meeting your targets. Those are things we already know. However, having said that, employers cannot just sit by idly while this legislation is in the process of being passed. This is legislation which will affect employers, and our view is that employer bodies and organizations have a critical role to play in changing or influencing the trajectory of this legislation. So our view is that listen to what we have to say today, think about the issues, engage your employer organizations, and make comments, become active. I mean, some of the targets are not realistic. You will see, and I think Craig will speak to some of those issues. And you'll see that there's also some debate. There's not sufficient clarity in our view on one or two of the issues, and in particular, the change from the word population group in the original draft regulations to designated groups in the revised regulations. So those are some of the issues which I think need to be ironed out in this draft. And there's certainly value in making comments on these issues and taking the issue further with your employer body. So I think let's get on to the talk. Next up, Gail.
Thank you, Neil. Morning, everybody. I've got the task of just trying to lay out for you the content of this regulation. So as Neil mentioned, it was published on the 1st of February this year, and it was published in terms of Section 15A of the Employment Equity Act, the Amendment Act, sorry, which, as we know, has not yet come into effect. So it's a little bit of a bizarre situation because we have a regulation that is, okay, it's draft, but it has been published for comment, while the enacting legislation hasn't been passed yet. So no doubt the Amendment Act will have to be passed first before these regulations come into effect. Now, the draft regulations are open for public comment for a period of 90 days. And that, according to our calculations, is up until the 2nd of May. We do believe it is important for employers to contribute and make comments because ultimately it is going to affect employers in the long run. Now, just to summarize, my sense of this is that the draft regulations have introduced substantial changes. I know Neil has mentioned that they're subtle. Yes, I agree in some respects they are subtle, but in other respects, I think that the changes are quite substantial. So, for example, there's a reference to, as Neil mentioned, affirmative action being of a temporary nature. Now, this is extremely unusual. There was always talk about there being a sunset clause for affirmative action. And throughout the years, that whole idea was completely dismissed. There was never a sunset clause. Certainly in prior legislation, the previous regulations, there was no mention of affirmative action being temporary. So I do find this quite interesting. What the impact of this will be, I don't know. Temporary nature is not defined, so I think it raises more questions than answers at this stage. Now, also, the regulations include a definition of designated employer that did appear in the previous regulations. So it's very positive that they have reinforced this again, where a designated employer is limited to employers with 50 or more employees, irrespective of their turnover. So that's very significant, unless they are an organized state or subject to a collective agreement. Those exceptions one would need to unpack carefully. Subject to a collective agreement that is defined, I'm not going to go into that. But I think this is obviously going to have a very positive impact, certainly for small employers with 50 or less. Now, also, the regulations include an explanation, albeit not too detailed, but there is some explanation which was missing from the previous draft regs, an explanation on the proposed, on how one determines the proposed 5-year targets. Also, there is a little bit more guidance for designated employers on how the targets are to be implemented. There is some reference to that. There's also a list of factors which can be taken into account by employers and obviously compliance officers when assessing whether an employer has a justifiable or reasonable basis for not complying with these targets. Now, Craig is going to deal with this in a little bit more practical detail, but essentially the word justifiable now appears, which wasn't there before. So I believe that's a positive step. And then just to confirm that the previous 18 economic sectors that have always appeared, certainly in the EAP, that's the economically active population data, as well as the previous regulations, those economic sectors still appear in these draft regulations. So there's no change there. Now, when setting targets, designated employers must take into account the following. Obviously, the workplace profile, the relevant 5-year numerical targets, which are set out in this draft regulation, and the applicable EAP. As I said, that is the economically active population, which Stats SA produces every year. So employers will be measured against meeting the relevant 5-year sectoral numerical targets. The targets need to be set, just to backtrack. No targets need to be set where any groups have exceeded the EAP for that occupational level. So it seems to me that the relevant and most important bar is the EAP. If you've reached the EAP, then you don't need to set targets. If employers have met or exceeded the numerical targets for a particular race or gender, then they must set targets towards the EAP. So again, the EAP, in my view, is the ultimate standard. What is important that has come out in these draft regs is that they've now clarified the position of national or provincial EAP. I think the previous reference in the previous draft was regional EAP. So now they've clarified this. So the question I'm raising is, are designated employers required to apply the demographic profile of the national or the provincial EAP stats? And the answer is set out in these draft regs. It says that it depends entirely on the scope of the designated employer's operations. So if an employer operates nationally, or whether it operates in a particular province or provinces. Now, employers with operations in more than one province, and I'm assuming that's not nationally. So if you're operating in 3 of the 9 provinces, then the regulations say that you must choose the provincial EAP where the majority of your employees are based. So that has now clarified the position. And then employers must choose either the national or the provincial EAP for the 5-year period, and they cannot use both. That was also in the previous draft regs. So as a further supposed clarity, the regs say that designated employers operating in multiple sectors must elect the EAP demographic of the sector which accounts for most of its employees. So that has now also been defined, which wasn't apparent from the previous draft. So now this for me has become the most confusing section. And I think each of us here have a different view. But essentially, the targets that appear in this draft document, it states that there are no separate targets prescribed either nationally or provincially for each population group at every level. So the way the regulations are phrased is that the targets are now referred to as designated groups. So each occupational level will now have a single target for each sector, with the only difference being male or female, respectively. The sectoral targets now apply to designated groups, as I've said. Now, this is defined, and we get this definition from the Employment Equity Act. Designated groups are Blacks, women, and people living with disabilities. And now they no longer break it down, which was apparent from the previous draft regs, where the previous regs used to talk about population groups, which were broken down into African colored, Indian whites, and Black. So this is quite interesting. And the question that one must ask is this a mistake or is this deliberate? Because if you look at it, for example, a designated group, which is Blacks, women, and people living with disabilities. If the target is, let's say, 25% male, are we saying that only a certain race will now be taken into account, or can we say that if we have that for women, that's going to be enough? It's not entirely clear. And I think that it's a little bit problematic the way it's been phrased. It might be favorable for employers, but it's a bit problematic. It doesn't comply with the Employment Equity Act, which specifically compels employers to take affirmative action measures to ensure, and this is the wording of the Act, the equitable representation of suitably qualified people from the designated groups. And that's the various races which are broken down. Now, on the face of it, this draft regulation doesn't do that. It also appears to contradict itself because the draft regulations say that employers must set numerical targets for all population groups. Now, what are population groups? It's obviously the previous understanding, which is African, colored, Indian, white, and black. So the actual targets itself don't necessarily do that. So this is, in my view, this creates a number of interpretations, and this may need to be clarified and explained, because as it stands, I don't think it's entirely clear. So the sectoral targets, the focus areas for the targets are, once again, top management, senior management, professionally qualified and middle management, and your skilled technical levels. So this does not mean that employers don't have to set targets for semi and unskilled employees. Although specific targets are not set in terms of the draft regulation for those levels, the regulation does say that employers still need to set numerical goals for those levels. And how would they do that? By taking into account, again, the EAP, which, again, as I said to you, is the high standard that must be observed. So I just thought I would highlight as an example what some of the targets are. So the lowest target that I can find is 15% of your workforce, and that would apply to females in top and senior management in agriculture, manufacturing, and wholesale. The highest target for females, and I'm only using this as an example, certainly in top and senior management, is over 35%. And this can be found in water supply, in waste management and remediation activities, public administration, defense, and compulsory social security. So one can see where the targets are and what they're aiming towards. And Neil has mentioned this, but I think it's very significant that the draft regulations reaffirm that there is no absolute barrier on any employment practices affecting people who are not from designated groups, and that no employment termination may be effected as a consequence of affirmative action. I believe this has come straight out of the solidarity concerns, and these have been highlighted in the regulations.
Right. Thanks, Gail. Just before we move on, Craig, I just thought we should mention that we have set aside some time at the end of this webinar for questions. There is a Q&A function. Please use that. Please do not use the chat function, otherwise it's probably going to get lost in there. So please type your questions and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And then I saw there was an issue about whether the slides will be shared. We're happy to share the slides with you at the end of the presentation. This presentation is also being recorded, and CHM has started a YouTube channel which will be posting the video on in due course. So you will be able to find us online. I think let's hand over to Craig now so that he could deal with some of the more kind of practical nitty-gritty aspects of these changes.
Thank you, Neil. As you say, my brief was to try and put a practical lens on things. Gail's obviously unpacked the regs for us from a legal point of view, but there are nuances, there are complexities in there. So I think to better understanding them, the looking at it through a practical lens makes a lot of sense. I've had to use my experience and had to make some assumptions to do that. So it's not a strict legal perspective. It's very much I put on my hat as an HR manager and said, well, what would I do if I was still back in the corporate world? Just to comment, first of all, as far as the timelines are concerned, because they're important from a practical perspective. Importantly, and Neil mentioned the need for comments, but there's no clarity on transitional arrangements. Very strange for me that you have these regs and there is this sort of memorandum to help you understand the regs, but there's no transitional arrangements. It's clearly missing. And I'm expecting that in the final regs or as a memorandum, possibly, there will be clarity on the transitional arrangements. I'm personally expecting that the final regs will be implemented this year. There is the risk of further postponement, Neil. There could be challenges. There are some very strange targets. There are still questions about the effectiveness and the completeness of consultations. But I think that given that this is the second draft of the regs, given that it's an election year, I'm fully expecting that we're going to get the button pressed and we're going to have to start this year. So in the absence of transitional arrangement notes, what does that mean? It means, first of all, that each company we can expect is going to have to redesign, is going to have to develop a new employment equity plan. And most of that is going to be brand new. Of course, you don't really, depending on where you are in the cycle, you don't have to redo your semi-skilled and your unskilled targets. But given that you're starting a new plan, and given that it's going to be for 5 years, if I was still an HR manager, I would start a completely new plan. It's a 5-year period. Most of us did not ever do 5-year plans. It's a long time in the modern business world. It's a very long time to plan for anything. So we're going to have to do it for 5 years. So I would press the reset button and I would start again. And if I was an HR manager, I would be thinking, gee, around about September, October, I possibly need to be ready to go. I need to be prepared and be engaging my exco on my board. I don't think we can wait and think that this is going to kick off in January. I think September, October is where we should be starting to prepare and get our minds around these new plans. Very importantly, that because the act is not signed into law yet, or we've got no effective date, and we don't have the regs, the current Employment Equity Act and the current regulations stay in place, including for the small employers that employ less than 50 people. So if your employment equity plan expires in August, you are going to have to design a new employment equity plan. Unfortunately for you, even though we're expecting that you're going to have to do a brand new plan come September, October, it will be very dangerous just to sit on your hands and say, well, I'm not going to be designated very soon, therefore I'm not going to do a plan. You need to do a plan. Likewise, come the end of the year, we're going to have to submit our EEA2 and our EEA4 report. So we're heading into a very strange period, Neil, a transitional period without any transitional guidelines to guide us. But I think we've got to be sensible. We've got to see what was said last time, what the Act says, and what the previous draft regs say, and I think start planning for your new plans from about September, October. Do not wait. I think that the deadlines could be quite short. Let's go on to target setting, and I'm going to try not to repeat what Gail has said, because Gail has already explained what the regs say as far as the target setting is concerned. I'm going to try and explain them from a practical point of view. And how I've rationalized this and explained it to myself, if you can do such a thing, is to say, really, as far as the EAP is concerned and the setting of targets, there's no real change. what has happened is that the regs, the Act and the regs, have provided an additional target. They've provided the so-called 5-year sector numerical targets, and they've chosen to use this word designated groups. I'm of the view that it's a mistake. I think you'll see when the final regs come out that will be clarified, and it quite possibly will become something like blacks, because what they've done, the drafters have done, they've taken the black numbers from the previous regs and they've just dropped them into the current regs, and they've recalled or renamed that data as designated groups. So it's pretty clear in my mind that designated groups is actually black employees, and that needs to be clarified. Whether or not it's black employees, the use of this sort of consolidated metric, this consolidated target, is progress. It does provide, in a fast-moving, agile world, it does provide some flexibility to the employers. Because if you, especially when you've got a small number of people at top management, and it so happens you appoint a colored woman and not an Indian woman, should that be held against you going forward, you will be able, when you assess your performance against the sectoral numerical targets, you will be able to count the Indian woman, even though your original plan was for a colored woman. So there's a mature, practical flexibility that the drafters have introduced with this term, designated groups, as I say, whatever the final designation is. So we have this additional benchmark. So how would I do it? I would do what I've always done. I would compile my targets. Now it's got to be for a 5-year period. I would compile my targets based on the EAP, because you have to have targets for every race and gender group. Even though there is this additional measure, which I'll talk to in a moment about designated groups, you have to have, in 5 years as a company, what is your target for African males, African females, and the like? You're still required to have all of that. So for me, the starting point would be, as we've always done, compile your targets based on the EAP. Then we've got a second check now. You then need to assess, it's like a stress test, assess those targets against the designated groups. And if you aren't achieving your designated groups in 5 years, we'll just then give it another go, give it another tweak. You're going to have to become creative. Some of the sectors the targets are particularly challenging. So there's going to have to be some creative thinking applied in terms of how you're going to do it. But those would be the steps I would follow. Importantly, at a very practical level, but for the HR people out there, I would expect that the EA12, which is the form we use to do the analysis before we prepare our targets and our plan, will provide for the EAP, and it will provide for these designated groups. So when you do your analysis, you'll already have to do 2 comparisons. In the past, we only used to compare to the EAP. Now you'll compare to both of them. Just a tip that comes to mind for me, and I've noticed this with some of my more recent clients now that I'm in the consulting world. Before you start your analysis and before you start your setting of your targets, check your data. Check that, especially for the groups that have more than one legal entity. Is your organizational structure correct? Are people employed where they should be? Are your occupational levels and your grades correct? Because you're using that baseline to set the target with very serious implications for a 5-year period. So for goodness sake, get your baseline correct. So if you do nothing else over the next few months, check your employer data, check your organizational structures, and get that starting point correct. That would be a practical tip. I have already made the point that I think people on quick reading, or they listen to a commentator on the radio, they think they're going to set targets in terms of designated groups. They are, but they've got to set targets in terms of the EAP for each race and gender, and that's that final point. That final tip as well on that slide I've mentioned already. I think given these targets, and given that we're almost restarting another phase of transformation, I would urge employers to be creative, be innovative around their targets. Don't just leave this to a junior HR person that go and do the targets. Think very carefully about your organizational structures and the various factors which we'll talk about now. Take this seriously and be creative. As far as those factors or criteria are concerned, this slide lists those. So the draft regulations for the first time confirm that we can use criteria when we determine these targets. Now, I know for myself, and I know for my clients, we've always used these criteria. I mean, it's just a sensible thing to do. You do look at the EAP, but you need to look at the inherent requirements of the job. You need to look at the pool of suitably qualified people. By the way, just a tip again, know that data. If you're in the legal world or you're in the financial services and you're recruiting accountants and CAs, or you're in the construction engineering world, know how many engineers are out there. Have that data. We've obviously always considered reasonable time for someone to acquire the qualifications or the competence to do the job. Very importantly, we've always looked at employee turnover. You have to look, if you're not expecting any growth in an occupational level, well, then you would look at turnover to see how you can then percolate and change and bring people up from the lower levels. And then also critically, we've always looked at recruitment and promotional. The regs call it trends, but we would look in most companies, we would see what has been the past practice, what has happened in your company. So those criteria are not new. All it's done is sort of codify and confirm that we need to think about these targets. We need to do it logically. It's not just about seeing sectoral numerical targets and drawing a straight line from where you are to there. You need to really apply your mind and consider these criteria and develop clever, informed, but obviously challenging targets. Neil, just going back to that other slide, my last point there, again, disabled people often get forgotten. And we must remember that whether or not they're included in the definition of disabled, I don't think they are generally going to be. That's my view, but it's a thing we need to be clarified. We've got a separate target. We've got 2%. And if you're an employer of 2,000, 3,000 odd people, 2% is quite a punchy number. So again, ensure you know who your disabled people are. With a number of my recent clients, we've refreshed the whole process. We've educated around disabled people. What is the definition of disabled? We've redone the EEA1 forms. And lo and behold, the numbers of the disabled people in each of those organizations has increased significantly. So the people are in your organization. Doesn't mean you mustn't go and find them outside when you recruit. But I promise you, every organization has got disabled people that haven't disclosed because they're worried about the implications. If you follow an education program and give them assurance that there'll be no victimization, and in fact, it's to their advantage if they disclose, I think they'll come out. And just to remind everybody that the 2% target for disabled has got no race or gender requirements in it. Thanks, Neil. Going on to the next section, and again, looking at it from a practical point of view, how are we going to ensure that we are compliant against the targets? And these are very important. Again, when we've been inspected by an inspector or we've had a DG review, we have explained to the Department of Labour, and we've used these factors to explain why we possibly in a particular company hasn't progressed. So, but again, I think it's a good and constructive thing that these have now been codified. And they're very important. I haven't listed all of them there. I've listed what I consider the most important. Insufficient recruitment opportunities, absolutely key. If you haven't got the vacancies, you can't bring people from outside. Insufficient promotion opportunities, for me, even more important, because I believe that internal promotions and building internally is the best way to go. Insufficient suitably qualified and competent candidates. And just going back to that earlier tip that I gave, you need to have your data. If you say there were insufficient people, you need to be able to prove to whoever's asking you the question that there were insufficient. And in my experience, people are very quick to say insufficient, but they don't have the empirical data to say it. It's because when they picked up a phone to phone somebody to come and get a job, that person wasn't available. That's not how it works. There's got to be some real data there that you can use. Transfers of business, mergers and acquisitions, that can have a big implication. And then, very importantly, Neil, impact of the economic circumstances. Again, if you're planning, and we're talking about a 5-year period, so if you're planning on a certain amount of growth, you're going to increase your imports, you're going to open 2 new stores every year, and then for some reason that doesn't happen, that's going to impact significantly on what happens to your headcount. So those are sensible, and they need to be used by the employers. One that's missing, and that's my first bullet there, which I think is equally important, is retention. I think retention could also be a reasonable ground. Most of us who have been in this world for some time have had an unfortunate situation where a key person from a designated group who's possibly been with you for years moves on for some reason, or something happens, possibly gets transferred to a legal entity in Switzerland or something, and all of a sudden you've lost your African female CFO. So I think retention, keeping people in your organization, could be another grounds for not achieving your targets. I do think that the whole issue of retention, poaching, turnover is going to increase the so-called war for talent. War for talent is a term that the HR people have been speaking about for a number of years across the world, including in South Africa. I think this process and these numerical targets is going to increase that war, or escalate the war, I guess would be the right word. I give you just one example, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I've just extracted for the wholesale and retail sector, and it's just the middle managers. And based on the BE Commission and Stats South Africa, with the report High Access, there were 51,000 people in that occupational level in that sector. In terms of the numerical targets, in 5 years, that's in 2029, 75% of those people need to come from the designated groups. I think that means blacks. So let's just humor me on that. At the moment, in terms of the last BE Commission, there were 61% black people in that occupational level. So there's a deficit of 14%. So over the next 5 years in that sector, I know this is high level, this is not at a company level, but there's that occupational level needs 14% additional people from the designated group / black in it. That's 7,000 odd people. That is a lot of people. This is one occupational level in one sector. Hence my point. I think you need to hang on to your people from the designated groups. You need to make sure that your employment proposition, your culture is favorable, and people from designated groups want to join your company. Obviously, that 7,000 is never going to be a real number because it's factored on economic circumstances, growth, etc., etc. But it's interesting that that's what the targets imply at the moment. Just that the second point is a lack of growth will complicate everywhere, and I've made that point. And then importantly, the flip side of the lack of growth, and I think both Gail and Neil have mentioned this, you cannot use termination tactics to create space. We've all seen it over the years. Part of a retrenchment program, people have used race and gender as a criteria, rightly or wrongly. That cannot happen anymore. We can't retrench a white person to recruit a black person. That's no longer acceptable based on these regulations. I think monitoring mechanisms, it's from a compliance point of view that I'm talking, is absolutely critical. My sense with a lot of employers, you have to have monitoring mechanisms, bear in mind, as part of the Act already. Your Employment Equity Forum, you should be reporting to your EXCO, you should be reporting to your board. But very often those are done sort of as an administrative compliance type process. My view is that going forward, those should be leveraged, especially at the EXCO and the board level. They need to monitor very carefully on, say, a quarterly basis, at least on an annual basis. Where are they? Where are they heading? So it's necessary for compliance, but I think there's a more practical, commercial, strategic reason why we need to use those forums. Finally, and this is not in the regs, this is my view, again, from a practical perspective. You need a sensible HR manager. He needs a paper trail. He needs a tracking logging system to monitor. And I personally, because I'm a little bit difficult with these things, I would do it on a monthly basis, but at least on a quarterly basis, definitely on an annual basis. How have you done? Not only we've always tracked our progress against targets, but why have you not achieved your targets? Going back to those justifiable reasons. Is it because of lack of growth? Is it because of lack of suitably qualified people? But you need a paper trail on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, because when the inspection gets done, and that might only get done in year 3, it might only get done in year 5. So you need a cumulative database of why you've not achieved. Not that I'm encouraging a negative perspective on this, but just to be prudent, have a system, even if it's an Excel spreadsheet with some sort of electronic place where you can, a portal where you can save your data. But don't assume that in 2 or 3 years' time you're going to be able to remember why you didn't achieve your targets. And because there's turnover within the organization, you can just see a DG review and there's a panic going around. Well, in year 1, 3 years ago, we wanted to employ a new HR, African female HR director. Why didn't we do it? Go back. Why didn't we do it? What was the reason? So that to me is the hot tip. My last 2 slides, Neil, and hopefully we're on track. Thank you, I will do it. Just in conclusion, just to summarize really, and talking mainly to the HR people and the people responsible, it's business as usual for 80% of what we've always done with employment equity plans. Get your baseline right, determine your targets against the EAP targets, but now there's this additional step. Then you've got to also, as a secondary benchmark, because EAP, I agree with Gail, EAP is still the dominant and the most important benchmark. There's a secondary benchmark now, and that's the designated groups. Check against that as well. So everything is the same, except that you've got this designated group that you have to assess against as well. And then I'm going to repeat myself regarding the importance of having a tracking and logging system. Don't leave it to the 5th year. And then finally, Neil, on the last slide, just 2 points. A little bit more philosophical, possibly. I think we're heading into the next phase of transformation. I think what is behind us is behind us. And if there are any leaders who maybe haven't been fully committed, have been reluctant to get involved, that maybe left it to HR or something, I think now's the time to get involved. It's truly become a strategic imperative if you consider, not that we've considered this, but we know from the Amendment Act, the issue of compliance certificates, the issue of fines, the issue of business with the state. Employment equity has always been a strategic imperative in my mind, but it's just been ratcheted up significantly. And any leaders in the organization who don't see it as a strategic imperative could be exposed. So we've almost got a last chance. Employers have got a last chance. Leaders have got a last chance. They've got another chance to get involved and make this happen. And it's not just about compliance, it's about plans. And I've listed there that in my mind, an employment equity plan and a human resources plan have to be integrated. Very often in companies, when I go and visit, they give me the employment equity plan. Do they even have an HR plan? How does the HR plan synchronize and integrate? They often don't. It's one and the same thing. And you need to be addressing in your HR ER plan things like this. Workforce planning. It's never been more important. HR people need to understand how to plan for their organization. When they do the budget and they do the business plans, you need to look at what's going to happen to your workforce over the next 5 years. That's daunting. It scares me a little bit. I can get my mind around 2 years or 3 years, but 5 years is a long time. So HR people better become more competent when it comes to planning. And you've got to, and my colleague of mine, Mike Beaumont, bashes me on the head about this all the time. Don't just do it from a numbers point of view. Look at it from the skills required. We're heading into an era of AI. We're heading into an era of enhanced productivity and the like. So when you plan for those skills, plan for the right skills that you're going to need. Don't plan for skills that are going to become redundant in 2 years because you're looking over 5 years. Succession planning, I've always said to the people who've worked for me, and they roll their eyes if they hear me say this now, but succession planning is the secret ingredient when it comes to transformation. Because you look at a particular role, say the CFO, and you work out in your organization who's going to take that over the next 5 years. What is your experience planning? What are you going to do with that individual? How are you going to move it around? You lock them in, doesn't mean money, you lock them in some way. So it gives some real traction to your planning. It's not like saying we're going to have a new African female CFO in year 4. You must know now who that African female is going to be and how you're going to be getting her there. So succession planning, I think, is key. You need to develop your people internally. I've mentioned this. Building is better than buying. They understand your culture and you know them. You're going to need suitably qualified people. What are you doing to develop? Do you have a bursary program? Do you have a learnership program? Are you accessing all the assistance that's out there? Or do you rely on poaching and buying people in the market? If you are, given the war for talent, you might be in for a very big surprise. I've mentioned the importance of employing disabled people. In my experience, companies very often don't focus on that. It should be your recruiters and your HR people should be required to try and access and find disabled people when they recruit. They are out there and they can come into mining, construction, and engineering. It's not impossible. Retention programs, I think I've spoken enough about. I think it's key. Finally, I think it's time we have to embrace this as a diversity issue, not as an employment equity compliance issue. Diversity is good. We all know that. We all know from business school and the articles we've read how it contributes to an organization, to the creativity and the quality of the decision making. I would encourage leaders, executive leaders, and HR people to approach this. You need to comply from an EE point of view, but approach it as a positive thing. Try and avoid the need to use the justifiable reasons. Rather achieve the targets, improve diversity, improve how your organization operates. Thanks, Neil.
Awesome. Thank you, Craig. I think we've got a few minutes left, 8 minutes for questions. I think just before I go through some of those on the Q&A. There are quite a few, and I think some of them we've answered as part of our talk, so they may have been a bit premature. But what do we, and this is to both of you, what do we make of these regulations? Are we likely to see any serious further developments? I think you've mentioned most likely not. We're going to push ahead in this new, the second phase of transformation, so to speak. We heard the Minister of Labour talking about the fact, and this whole process started several years ago, that the carrot hasn't worked. So now we're going to get the stick. We have a stick and carrot approach in circumstances where you saw the unemployment levels coming out at about 32% now. The war for talent, as you say, lack of skills in the available pool. If there's one takeaway from today's talk from each of you, what would you say is the takeaway from the seminar?
I would say it's coming, and I think it's going to come this year. You might see changes in the final regulations, but I think employers need to start planning now. Don't wait. Start planning, because that baseline and the creative, informed thinking is so important. Don't rush come September, October. Think it through. What is my organizational structure? Do some of this workforce planning that I'm encouraging. Spend the time between now and September to see this as a proper business program, a strategic program aligned with the business program. So my takeaway would be, it's coming. Get serious, get professional, approach this properly. If you need assistance, get assistance. Don't just leave it to somebody who's overwhelmed in the HR department and think, crikey, all of these issues. As you would if you were doing any sort of major intervention, major program in the business space. Get serious, be professional about it. Yes?
Yeah, I think, Neil, I would just say that I think these regulations are positive in a number of respects. I think they reaffirm things that we saw in the Employment Equity Amendment Act. They've come out again in these regulations, and I think that's a positive move. We've also got a lot more guidance that we didn't have before. I do think there are areas that are going to need to be interpreted, and that's obviously the distinction between designated groups and the previous breaking down of the various race groups. I think that must be clarified as in the population groups. So look, I would say that yes, I agree with Craig. I think this is coming, and I think there are lots of positives, and I think employers need to adopt a positive attitude if one can in our current circumstances. I accept that, but we do need to look at how we can progress the whole issue of transformation and diversity. And I think the Act gives us, or at least the regulations, certainly gives us some more clarity on how it's going to be possible.
All right, there's a question here. Taking into account the rule of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value, will it now be a defense to pay more when trying to attract talent from a designated group?
Interesting question, probably more a legal one. My gut feel would be no, I don't think you can. I think you've got that legislation, but maybe Gail's better positioned to.
I don't think it's going to be a simple yes or no. I think the equal pay legislation, employers have to have some measure of discretion. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have a talent war, as you've said, and I think employers are going to be hard pressed to try and attract the talent that they need. And perhaps that's a justifiable reason for increasing salaries.
I think it is.
It would be, in my view.
And the regulations on equal pay, I think, already speak to those sort of issues.
Yes.
So, I think that issue wouldn't be too much of a problem. There's a comment and a question from Søren Mudley. He says it's clear that succession planning, talent management, skills development, and reward and recognition, and the integration of these practices will be imperative. And I think we agree with that. And he said, please confirm that the term Black consistently means African, Indian, and colours.
Correct. In terms of the Employment Equity Act, that's the definition.
There's a question, if your current plan's term runs out and there is a delay in gazetting these draft regulations beyond the next reporting dates, what is the recommendation for submitting plans? Should we submit 1-year plans until the regulations are passed, or do a 5-year plan based on the existing amendments only? That's from Yumna Cunningham.
Yumna, thank you. I would do a 1-year plan, but I would take the opportunity, Yumna, and I know how efficient you are. I would take the opportunity to test your baseline data against the 5-year plan. So officially do it as a 1-year plan, but start getting all your ducks in a row and informally, if that's the right word, do a 5-year plan as a bit of a trial run for the 5-year plan that's to come.
Talia has a question. It says the new EE plan that will have to be drawn up, will it have to be 5 years? Do we no longer have a decision ourselves regarding the duration of the plan?
My understanding it is a 5-year period.
Yeah.
I think the regulation says that clearly.
Yeah, it's to align with these new targets.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's unfortunate, and it's a challenge, but it's something we're going to have to get our minds around. I agree with Gil.
Yeah. Ilani Kutsia said, will small employers, those with less than 50 employees, still be able to do EE reporting, even if they are no longer a designated employer? So it's the voluntary compliance. I think that's been done away with under the amendment. Is it then, she says, and is it then good practice to still review or develop an EE plan for small employers?
I think it is. So there is no voluntary compliance.
It's obligation.
Yeah. But I would think it's good practice. You're in South Africa, be a responsible corporate citizen.
Absolutely.
I would do it. Bear in mind as well that even if you're lower than 50, and this is, I don't want to muddy the water, but there is a BE aspect to this as well. So that same employer may want a BE certificate. And of course, with that particular element of the BE code, depending what sector they fall into. So I would say it would be good practice. And I would think that any responsible board in South Africa would want something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I think it's been a very informative webinar. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Gail. All of the slides will be available fairly shortly after this. We'll be sending out emails. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.